Welcome to Podcast on the Brink, your weekly dose of Indiana basketball news and discussion, brought to you by the Assembly Call and Inside the Hall. I'm your host, Jared Morris. Join me live at assemblycall.com every Thursday night and immediately following every IU game for our live IU postgame show. And visit InsideTheHall.com for complete coverage of IU basketball and to join the discussion in the Inside the Hall Premium Forum.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Matchup. I'm Ben Ladner, joined by Seth Tao, live and in person from an undisclosed location in Bloomington, Indiana. It is a Wednesday night, about 6:20 Eastern Time. We are a few days away from Indiana taking on Purdue. That'll be a Saturday afternoon tip, 2 p.m. You and I will both be there. I'll be on color commentary for WIUX as well as doing some stuff for Inside the Hall. You'll be there with Inside the Hall, so we'll both be at the scene covering it live. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. I survived the East Coast snowstorm last weekend, and
that's good.
Got out. My flight got canceled coming back from Maryland, but I made it back. So
it happens. It happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. So obviously, Indiana fans program, whatever. It feels like kind of a crisis mode. Some people are ready to kind of resort to crisis mode. I don't know if I'm quite there yet, but it's getting there. They've lost 3 in a row. Ugly loss to Nebraska on Wednesday. What is it? Monday night. It's Wednesday night tonight. Monday night, tough loss to Nebraska, 15 points. Just didn't come out with any effort. I don't know that we necessarily need to rehash too much of that game because
no one will listen to the rest of the podcast.
Right, and there's been so much hand-wringing about it already that we've kind of worn out that talking point. The more useful thing would be to look ahead and kind of say, okay, they've got Purdue coming up. They've got on the 25th, Michigan will come to Assembly Hall. That'll be a huge game. You've got Northwestern. I think you got to win that game on the 22nd. And so, it's kind of one game at a time. In the Big Ten, it's such a deep conference. It's such a tough conference with such a big middle of the pack that really every game is kind of a new fight that you have to prepare mentally and physically for to kind of go to battle. And in Purdue, we see another team that, like Indiana, is kind of in that middle of the pack. And at this point, I think you'd have to say Purdue is a better team qualitatively than Indiana. Although, if you disagree, certainly,
I don't know. I mean, there are times this season where I've thought there's no question Indiana's better than Purdue. But at this point, I mean, coming off that game on Monday against Nebraska, I mean, how can you say that Purdue isn't the better team right now, at least with the way they're playing?
Yeah, Purdue's playing really well right now.
Purdue's playing really well because they've started to get a lot of their role players have really started to round into shape and come into form. Carsen Edwards has been performing like one of the best players in the conference all season, really. Yeah. But that wasn't always enough in their early games. They dropped a bunch of they played a pretty good non-conference schedule. But they dropped a bunch of those games because in spite of Edwards having a monster game, just because no one else around him was really doing anything. But now, Ryan Klein has broken out of his slump, and they've got a little more production from Nojel Eastern and Matt Harm. Some of these other guys have really started to round into shape and settle into their roles. And Purdue is playing like a much better basketball team now because of it.
Yeah, they're kind of trending in opposite directions, But I think this point stands that they're both kind of in the middle of the pack. Right, that neither team is as good as a Michigan or a Michigan State, who I think are clearly in their own tier. And then you can get kind of farther down. There's 8 teams that really you could make an argument are kind of neck and neck with one another. Yeah. You could subdivide within that group of teams, but then you have your Northwesterns, your Penn States, your Rutgers, Illinois, kind of at the bottom of the conference. Losses that if you lose to those teams, that's a bad loss. You can't afford to do that, especially for Indiana at this point in the season. But yeah, you mentioned Purdue and their players just kind of rounding into form, kind of getting their role players on the same team. Carsen Edwards is just, you said, one of the best players in the conference. He might be one of the best players in the country right now. Shooting 38% on threes on 10 attempts per game. And that's wild. Yeah. He is just absolutely filling it up from deep. He can do it off the dribble. He can do it off the catch. He doesn't get many opportunities off the catch because he has the ball in his hands so often, but he can get to the rim. He's just playing a really efficient style of basketball right now. And Purdue, obviously he's at the center of everything that they do. And, like you said, they're getting some of those complementary players starting to shoot the ball a little bit better, starting to come into their own as playmakers, play with a little bit more aggressiveness, assertiveness. Matt Harms, after coming off the bench last year, has kind of filled that Isaac Haas void. Not quite the same style of player, but just in terms of having that big presence in the middle, someone who can do some really useful things for them. And so I think at this point, Indiana's kind of, losing their identity. They're getting away from it. They're searching for something that, trying to figure out who they are, maybe reinvent themselves a little bit. Meanwhile, Purdue is really starting to hit their stride. And I think it seems like they really know what they are, and they kind of have a better idea of how they want to play and what they want to do than Indiana does right now. And because of that, I think they carry some really good momentum into this game, whereas Indiana is still kind of searching. Yeah,
and it helped. It's much easier to find your identity like that when you have a player like Edwards, and he's averaging 24.8, 24.9
about
points
25
per
a
game.
Yeah,
which is absurd. That's just absolutely ridiculous. And it's not like he's really doing anything like drastically different than he did last year. When
taking
he
a few
really
more
good.
threes. I think that's the big thing.
But it's just other than that, it's really just he's kind of just gotten more and more efficient with everything that he does, and he's just a really tough player to stop. And the worry for me with Indiana with stopping him is just, what have you seen from Indiana guarding point guards in recent games that makes you think that they'll be able to stop Carsen Edwards? I mean, Anthony Cowan against Maryland had a huge game against Indiana. He was really the reason why Maryland was able to start coming back. Once Cowan started finding some holes in the Indiana defense, it all started to crash and burn for Indiana. And last game, and on Monday against Nebraska, Glenn Watson Jr. had a really good game for Nebraska. And it's just, Indiana's going to have to change something up with the way they defend point guards, because what they're doing is not working.
Yeah, and you also just run into the basic question of who guards Carsen Edwards.
I was thinking about this a lot coming into this podcast.
And I don't know, they'll probably start Devontae Green again. That's kind of just what they've been going with. But you can make a good argument that they've lost the last 3 games with him in the lineup, and Phinisee's back now. Maybe you want to get him. I think at some point they have to get Phinisee back in the starting lineup.
I think he's just too good. I mean, you may end up having both of them in the lineup depending on Al Durham's
That's right.
status.
I totally forgot about Al Durham. Yeah, so let's assume that Green and Phinisee are both starting. Who is the better matchup there for Edwards?
Probably Green, looking in terms of size, but I don't know. On the other hand, Green was the guy starting against these other 2 point guards in the last 2 games, and that didn't go well. But here's the interesting idea based on something that I found from going through some stuff.
Yeah.
When Purdue's last loss was to Michigan State, and Michigan State beat them pretty good. They were the only team. Michigan State was the only team to actually shut down Carsen Edwards this season. He had a season low 11 points against Michigan State. And so my first thought when I went back to watch some highlights from that is, all right, who did Michigan State have guarding? And they had Matt McQuaid guarding Carsen Edwards. Matt McQuaid is 6'5" and 200 pounds.
Yeah.
So that almost makes you wonder, would Indiana's best bet be to stick a bigger defender on him? Maybe, Justin Smith is their best defender. It seems extreme, but
that would be really interesting.
That would be really interesting. But look at the size of you give up a little bit of size, but not as much as you might think in other matchups, because let's say you do have Justin Smith guarding Carsen Edwards, then you probably have Devontae Green, or you have Devontae Green and Rob Phinisee. Those two are probably going to split up between Nojel Eastern and Grady Eifert, both 6'6", 220. And you're giving up size there, but again, I feel like you'd rather have a size advantage on Carsen Edwards and lose size on the other matchups than have it be closer to even in terms of size with Edwards, especially knowing that Matt McQuaid was able to shut Carsen Edwards down. And I'm figuring that Romeo Langford is probably going to get Ryan Klein.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's something Jared brought up. Maybe it was Dr. Clavio. I talked to both of them yesterday, and one of them, I can't remember who, brought up that point that Matt McQuaid was the one that guarded Carsen Edwards. And Michigan State plays really good team defense too. That's part of it. It's not just McQuaid being an awesome defender, even though he's solid. So you do need a good team effort on that. This is one of those games where I've been critical of the way Indiana defends pick and rolls in the past. I think hedging, it puts a lot of strain on your defense in ways that a team like Indiana, just if you're not totally tied in and playing with max effort, it can just destroy you. But against a guy like Carsen Edwards, that's actually one of the few scenarios and matchups where I would actually encourage and be in favor of hedging, because you're able to just, the whole point of that is we're going to shut off the ball. We're not going to allow penetration, not going to allow this guard to turn the corner off the pick. And so if there's one guy in the Big Ten that you don't want like pulling up off of a pick and roll or, getting ahead of steam, moving into the lane off of the pick and roll, then it's Carsen Edwards. That's
right.
The one guy that really can pose a threat as both a shooter and a driver off the pick and roll. And so in that sense, the Indiana's kind of base defense could actually maybe be more effective against Purdue than it is against, say a Nebraska or a Maryland, these teams that Indiana kind of struggle to match up with. The other point, I guess, would be maybe you stick McRoberts in the starting lineup and not start either keep bringing Phinisee off the bench or move Green back to the bench and put Phinisee in.
You could allow McRoberts to reclaim his original spot in the starting lineup if Durham can't go.
Right, exactly. And so maybe that allows you to do one of two things. You could either stick McRoberts on Carsen Edwards and take your chances there. I think with the back injury, he's not the same guy that he was last year. I think last year, Zach McRoberts, I don't like my chances against Carsen Edwards, but comparatively, I think that's not a terrible matchup. This year, I just don't think he has the mobility. He doesn't quite have the strength that he did last season just because he's been so banged up. But what it also allows you to do is maybe put a guy like Justin Smith, if you want to get extreme, and put a big, long, strong defender on Carsen Edwards. Then if you have to give up those size disadvantages in other places, it's not quite so drastic if you can play McRoberts at the 4 defensively for all intents and purposes and kind of have him and Romeo Langford on the wing, kind of a like-sized wing combination, and then either Phinisee or Green as the only real small guy on the floor.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's just going to come down to A, obviously what Al Durham's status is, but B, where's McRoberts in terms of health, because he's been limited by nagging injuries, by that nagging back injury all season. And I wrote in the Assembly Call post-game email that he's just been counterproductive offensively. And I mean, there's a case to be made defensively as well, but a little less so than what he does on the offensive end. But that's not what we're talking about right now.
Right.
In terms of size, what you say makes sense. It's just in terms of execution, I don't know, just because of his back status and because that really limits his mobility and his physicality. Yeah,
well, I mean, you said we're not really talking about the offense, and that's true, but I do think that kind of ties in with it, because if he's just a non-threat on offense, if you're losing so much on that end of the floor that you can't afford to play him on defense, then that's something, and that kind of changes, maybe the calculus of the rotation and kind of your decision making there limits your options. And Indiana doesn't really have a whole lot of options right now, especially if Durham is out. My instinct is that he will be for this Purdue game, just the way that
the way things have gone with this team.
And he didn't come back against Nebraska.
Right.
It's not a case where he kind of like limped off the floor and then they put some tape on it and he gave it a shot. Like they ruled him out basically immediately after that injury. And so that makes me think that it's going to be something that takes some time. Now, they do have almost a week between games here. So, training staff, work your magic. Maybe you can get him out there to go on Saturday. But at this point, I would be pretty surprised if Al Durham is able to play, let alone, give good minutes out there. So that probably limits your depth even more. There's probably a separate conversation to be had about the depth of Indiana right now, especially on the wing, because all the available guys are basically bigs. It's Clifton Moore, Jake Forrester, Deron Davis, Evan Fitzner are kind of the guys that you say.
Davis is barely available.
Right. And so
it probably shouldn't be available based on what we've seen.
Yeah. And so those are the candidates that might get some more minutes, just to have bodies on the floor, but none of them are wings. And so do you try Demezy Anderson? Do you give him some run? I mean, do you play more 2-guard lineups? Do you play more Phinisee and Green together? Do you give Johnny Jager a try? Probably not. But we're almost to that point. It's almost like, and it's funny that we're talking about this before Purdue, because you remember 2 years ago, Tim Priller actually played a role in that Purdue game, and that was kind of the break glass in case of emergency option. Maybe we get there against Purdue again 2 years later. I don't really know. It's so easy to kind of criticize from afar, or you speculate from afar and say they need to do this, they need more depth, blah, blah, blah. But what's the answer? Who do you turn to? I don't really know.
Yeah.
But it's certainly, recent circumstances have not made it easy for
Indiana. And it's really amazing given that going into the season, one of the biggest strengths about this team that everyone was talking about was it's a really deep team.
And we said the same thing last year.
Right. Everyone going into the season, it's such a deep team. They could realistically play a 9-man rotation and be fine. Now, barely any team is going to play a 9-man rotation.
And Fitzgerald was way worse than we thought he'd be. And Davis is injured, all that. Yeah.
Right. So the injuries have obviously contributed, but just it's baffling how a team that seemed so deep just a month or two ago, not a month ago, like 2 months ago, we thought this team was pretty deep. And now suddenly you look at the bench and you hear crickets.
Yep. And the loss of Jerome Hunter really hurts too, because to me, he was a guy that projected as a versatile defender and, a guy who can maybe score a little bit on offense, but more than anything, just his defense can, his ability to guard the 3 and the 4, maybe even the 2 sometimes if you need to kind of get crazy.
Which is what they've gotten out of Justin Smith, in fairness.
Yes. No, that's true. But it's
having more of those guys would be helpful right now.
To have another guy who could just have some versatility on defense. Because right now, McRoberts, we thought, and last year he was a versatile defender. But this year, it's just he's so limited that he can really only guard 1 or 2 positions out there, and can't really do it all that well just because he's physically limited. So it's tough. It just makes things really, really tough. And with the size Purdue has in Matt Harms, Juwan Morgan is going to have a tough time. Evan Fitzner has proven just to be, a piece of tissue paper on defense, basically.
Yeah.
Deron Davis can hardly move. It's just, there are not a lot of good options. Yeah. So maybe we find a way to tie this in with the Purdue game and Clifton Moore. Is this, if you're Archie Miller, are you looking at this Purdue game thinking I got to play Clifton Moore? Are you coming into the game planning on playing Clifton Moore?
I mean, I would be at this point. I mean, he wasn't terrible against Nebraska.
That's true. That is true. He was not terrible.
He was not. He only played 5 minutes, but he wasn't terrible. And the fact that he showed that some sort of promise that he could improve in the future is good. And that's, I don't want to be, I'm really trying here, but
Well, defensively, I think is where the question is, because he's proven to be
his defense can be suspect. His ball security, his rebounding needs improvement, but he's shown better, I think, awareness on the offensive end than we've seen. Because there would be times when he would go in garbage time last year, or even at the beginning of this year. I mean, he would just kind of look like he was just out there sometimes, just out there kind of running around. But now at least he seems like he's in sync with the rest of the offense, and if you pass him the ball, he may actually be able to do something with it.
Yeah, offensively is not totally where I'm concerned. I think he's not going to do much on offense anyway. He's going to be nothing more than Justin Smith on offense, which isn't very much because Juwan and Romeo are asked to do so much. They're going to do everything anyway. Defensively is where you really have to be good,
right?
Because you can be targeted a little bit more easily on defense. Defense is, just inherently a more team-based concept than offense. And in that Penn State game, I did not think he was good defensively. I thought he was okay in the Nebraska game. He hasn't really played minutes in pretty much any other game, so we don't have a great sample size to work with. Theoretically, he's got some mobility, but it has, kind of happy feet sometimes and lurches in the wrong direction and just gets out of position. Doesn't really know where he's going or where he needs to be. And that's because he doesn't play very much, in fairness. It's not like he's not trying. It's just a tough thing to grasp when you're not playing. And so, in theory, he's got some length, some quickness. Maybe you say he can guard Matt Harms for 5 minutes. Just throw him in there.
Exactly.
Spell Juwan Morgan for a couple minutes each half.
And that's what it boils down to with this, no pun intended. That's what it boils down to with this matchup. It boils down to, when you're looking at the bench big options, assuming that Davis is not, we're not factoring Davis into this, but when you're looking at Fitzner and Moore, who is going to be able to keep Matt Harms in check for small stretches at a time? And right now, I think Moore is the better option to do that.
I think so too. But I would also add that it's easy, in theory, it's easy to kind of be comfortable with that. But then when you actually get to that part of the game, and
I don't know if comfortable is the right word to use there.
Relatively. But when you actually get to the game and you're in the middle of that 3-minute pocket where Clifton Moore is guarding, a good player, are you okay with it then? Can you resist the urge and the temptation just to yank him if it doesn't work? That would be my question, because Jared and I talked about this yesterday. It's kind of this, catch-22 where you need to rest Juwan Morgan and Romeo Langford, but you also need someone who can be like not terrible enough to actually survive those minutes. Like, you can't just fall off a cliff on either end of the floor if you don't play those guys. Like, so it's kind of,
and that's what happened against Michigan,
right? It's kind of these two conflicting pressures, if you will, to make different decisions, and it's just a really, really difficult place to be. And I don't envy Archie Miller when it comes to making rotational decisions.
Yeah, it's just turned into such a mess off the bench. They've gotten absolutely nothing off the bench since conference play restarted.
Yeah.
They've just gotten absolutely nothing off the bench. And that's a big reason why they're in this slide, is because, Romeo's going to get his, Juwan is going to get his, but it's similar to problems that Indiana teams of the past couple of years faced, because, last year it was only Juwan, and the guys around him weren't able to consistently step up enough. And it's the same thing this year, except he has Romeo, and everyone thought, he's going to have somebody else that'll consistently be putting up numbers night in, night out. But clearly that still is just not enough, and they're needing the committee of third scoring options has gone quiet.
It has, yeah, and maybe Devontae Green's that guy. If he can get going, maybe it's Rob Phinisee if he kind of gets back into the flow of things after the concussion. We can turn, I guess, now to an interesting matchup on the wing: Romeo Langford and Nojel Eastern. Eastern, a versatile, long-armed, good athlete, solid defender with some ball handling ability on the other end of the floor. But that, to me, is kind of the matchup to watch in this game, because Eastern, like I said, good defender. Romeo Langford, obviously.
He might be their best defender.
Right, and Romeo is obviously an all-conference level scorer. And so
one of the best finishers, if not the best finisher at the rim in the country.
Yeah, so that's going to be a really fun matchup. And we've talked before about, when we kind of preview these matchups, so-and-so team just doesn't have anyone that can guard Romeo Langford. We've said that several times before. But Purdue is actually a team that matches up quite well with him, relative. You're never going to shut him down completely. But Purdue at least has someone that can bother him and make things difficult.
Right. I mean, Eastern, 6'6", 220, like, that's the size that can get in Romeo Langford's face. And he's
quick.
And
long. Yeah.
He's a good defender, and it's going to be a challenge for Romeo Langford to continue to put up big numbers like he's been, and that could be a big problem for Indiana. I mean, they haven't really shown us at this point that they could win when Romeo or Juwan has an off night. Yeah,
and speaking of Juwan, Matt Harms, not a poor defender in his own right. He's a solid rim protector, could actually play a role there on Romeo Langford. We talked about his finishing at the rim. Harms is a huge body to put in the middle of the floor, 7'2", 230 pounds. So he's not quite as big as Isaac Haas, just in terms of bulk and strength, but the size, the length is pretty darn close.
And for about half, and the example to look at with this is when Morgan went up against John Teskey a couple weeks ago, and Morgan ended up having a really good game up at Michigan, but it's easy to forget that he was really struggling in the first half of that game, and a lot of that is because of John Teskey.
I agree. Yeah, and I think so Harms, and that begs the question where if Harms is able to be effective as a rim protector on Romeo Langford's drives and is able to be effective as a post defender on Juwan Morgan's touches, where does that leave you who scores the ball if you're Indiana? And so, it's not that I don't think Purdue necessarily has all that much more talent than Indiana. I don't think they're necessarily like a, clearly, supremely, qualitatively better team than IU. I just think this is a really kind of uncomfortable matchup for Indiana just because of the way, Indiana doesn't match up great with Purdue. They match up okay, but not great. But Purdue, I think, matches up quite well with Indiana. And I could very well see, kind of the more we talk through it, I could very well see this just being a game where Indiana can't get anything going offensively and Purdue just kind of pulls away late in the game.
Yeah, and I'm just as worried about Indiana defensively in this game. I mean, just especially given the way Indiana's struggled to close out on threes, probably for the last three halves of basketball they played. I mean, they were leaving in the second half of that Maryland game, they were leaving Maryland shooters wide open on a lot of threes, and good shooters too. Not that they were just guarding the good shooters on the outside. They were leaving like Eric Ayala, who shoots like 48, 50%. From threes, they were giving him wide open looks.
I thought even against Nebraska.
Yeah, Nebraska
had like a 5-minute stretch in the first half where they just couldn't score. But even during that time, I thought they were getting decent looks. They got like 2 or 3 or 4 corner threes.
Right.
They got some kick out top of the key threes. They got some looks around the basket. And Indiana had something to do with that, but largely those shots just weren't going in. And so Purdue, they shoot 37% from 3 as a team. That's, around top 50 in the country. So if you give them those open looks time after time after time, that's going to, that could just bury you.
And they're going to look for those because the shooting percentage is one thing, but look at the numbers in terms of average attempts and makes per game, because they average 28.6 attempted threes per game. That's 12th in the country. Yeah. And they make 10.7 per game, which is 6th in the country. And so they're one of the more high volume 3-point shooting teams in the country. And again, as I said, Indiana hasn't really fared well against the 3 in recent games.
Yeah. I mean, and now it's really kind of 2 guys who are doing most of that damage. It's Carsen Edwards taking 10 threes a game, and it's Ryan Klein, we haven't even talked about yet, taking almost 8 per game. So it's those 2 guys who both, they shoot a combined like 39%. They're really good. They can really knock down shots, again, off the catch, off the dribble. So those are, it's a little easier in the sense that you don't have to worry about everyone on the roster shooting threes, but those 2 guys you really have to key in on.
Right. But I mean, again, Edwards has been able to do whatever he wants against almost any team.
It won't be easy, but if you're looking for a blueprint, maybe that's it.
I mean, yeah, if you stop Carsen Edwards, you're probably going to win the game.
You're not getting this analysis anywhere else.
If you stop Carsen Edwards, you're probably going to win the game. But I mean, when you look at the other, Michigan State stopped Carsen Edwards and won. But when you look at the other games that Purdue won, the other team, like when Carsen Edwards still had big games and they lost, the other team pretty much had to shut down almost everybody else on the team. And when you look at the box scores from those games, nobody else really had any numbers that really caught your eye from those games, and that's why they won. And I mean, Ryan, the thing to worry about with Klein, to talk about him a little bit more, he would get in stretches early in the season where he would fall into slumps 3-point shooting, and like they lost a game to Texas in December when Klein went 1 for 9 from 3-point range. They lost the next game to Notre Dame in Indy when Klein went 3 for 9. Yeah. But he's been much, much better shooting the 3. He's shooting over 50% in the last 2 weeks. But again, it's just so tough, and these guys are doing it against solid teams. It's like it's not like they're just running over not like weak non-conference opponents anymore. Like they've upped their game as Big Ten play has started. Yeah. And what do you do against a team like that?
I don't know. I don't have a ton of great answers. We've talked about why the reasons Indiana won't win this game. But maybe we'll shift to like a rosier outlook. What are the reasons that Indiana can win this game, or why they will win this game?
I think the top thing to look at is just in terms of effort. When they came out against Nebraska, clearly they were just like lacking effort, and Juwan Morgan said as much after the game, like they weren't totally ready to play. There's absolutely zero chance that in an IU-Purdue game at Purdue, there's no way that Indiana's not ready to play mentally. Yeah. So you can at least count on they're going to come out and give a better effort than they gave on Monday. Beyond that, I think if Romeo and Juwan are the 2 best players on the court, like we say in most matchups, if Romeo and Juwan can be two of the best players on the court, but we'll say 2 of the 3 best players on the court, knowing that Carsen Edwards is going to get his, Indiana will have a chance in almost every game if those 2 put up good numbers. Yeah,
I agree on the effort point, too. I think, I talked about why I think their Indiana scheme is actually well suited for Purdue. If you can execute it a little bit better, they didn't execute it all against Nebraska, and that stems from their effort. If you don't come out playing hard, if you don't make those rotations, then you're not executing the scheme. If you can execute a little bit better, be locked in, be focused, really, focus on the game plan, like that is just a start. That's a start. Like you have to get that at a very fundamental level. And then, Romeo Langford, Juwan Morgan, like it's again, kind of reductive to say if those guys play well, Indiana will win, but that's kind of how it goes. Right. To me, I guess to be more specific on that point, if you can get Romeo Langford some open 3-point looks, like if you can generate 1 or 2 catch and shoot threes early in the game, maybe get him looking, kind of dribbling into some pull-up attempts, let him kind of operate in the pick and roll and see if you can free up some space that way. That, to me, is kind of the way to get the ball rolling offensively. The last couple of games, and I think this is something Purdue will do as well, but Nebraska and Maryland both, to start the game, they were really showing hard on Langford when Indiana ran pick and rolls. And then as the game kind of wore on, Romeo was able to find some more space, kind of work around those. The bigs weren't showing quite as hard as the game wore on. And so if you can get him some open looks early, get him into a rhythm earlier, because the last couple games, his rhythm has come in the second half.
Right.
He's not really able to do a whole lot early in the game. But if you can get him rolling early on in the game, and then you have 36 minutes of great Romeo Langford play instead of 26 minutes of Romeo Langford play, that's a big difference for Indiana.
That's a great point, and I think that is one of the underrated issues that Indiana's been having in their recent slide. Just not getting a full enough performance from Romeo Langford. As much as everybody wants to talk about, and rightfully they should talk about the supporting cast and how no one else is stepping up, Romeo Langford is the star of this team, and he's a great player and has shown it even in these losses, has played very well in almost every game. But to be a star, you got to show a little bit more every game you play, and he's faded, if anything, a little bit, and that's in the sense of he's just not. We still have not seen a complete performance from him this season, I feel.
Yeah, the Illinois game was pretty close.
The Illinois game was pretty close, but he always. You mentioned like the last couple games he's taken a while to get going. I don't know that you could point to any single game he's played this season and say, "Wow, right off the bat, Romeo Langford is establishing himself in this game." Yeah,
and maybe it starts with Juwan Morgan. Maybe you give him some touches in the post early in the game, because as much as I'm in favor of just putting the ball in your best player's hands and letting Romeo Langford run 1 million pick and rolls per game, I think that's a good strategy largely. As much as I like that, I think maybe they get a little too reliant on that. And I'm not saying that they should do that any less, but maybe you try to mix it up a little bit more and don't do it like in such concentrated volume where they'll run like 5 possessions in a row. Romeo pick and roll, one after the other. Maybe you mix in some Juwan Morgan post-ups early in the game, try to get some kick-out threes, get Romeo out, activate him as a cutter, moving down the lane, playing off of other guys as opposed to creating everything himself. And then the second thing I would point to, maybe to get him, in a rhythm early, is the free throw line, because he's one of the best at in the Big Ten at getting to the free throw line. His free throw shooting has actually ticked up the last month or so. He's just starting to hit some more shots from there. And he's up to
83% in the last 2 weeks of the free throw line.
So he's doing a really good job, like in the second half, late in games, just attacking the basket, getting to the line. But again, it's been early in the game. He hasn't really been able to find space in there and get to the charity stripe. So I think maybe if you're him, I think you come out with the mindset of, I'm going to attack the basket. I'm going to get to the rim. I'm going to get to the foul line. And if Purdue takes that away, I'm going to, pull up for 3 or whatever kind of thing the defense is going to give him. But I think you gotta hunt for shots if you're Romeo Langford. And it's up to IU to kind of put him in position where he can do that.
Yeah, I agree. And it just goes back to what I said. He needs to, you established on it. I'll bring it back a little bit. He just needs to establish himself. And the word I used earlier in the season that I'll bring back, he needs to assert himself more. Because there are just times where he's hesitant to show, like, he'll basically be like, I know I'm the best player on the court right now, but I am just going to hand it off and let my teammates work, before realizing I need to be the best player on the court if my team is going to win this game. Yeah,
the one game I think he did a really good job of that was the Louisville game. He came out, hit a couple, mid-range jumpers, step backs, crossovers early in the game, got going. But you're right, aside from that, it hasn't really been a regular occurrence. And so this is a big game, a rivalry game in Mackey Arena against Purdue, Saturday afternoon. Like you said, if you can't get up for this game, like, what are you doing?
Exactly.
So, this is the game to do it. This is the game to come out and, be an ass kicker.
The other player who I think could be a key is, if he's fully healthy, I think Rob Phinisee being back. Yeah. If he's fully healthy, I think a healthy Rob Phinisee helps this team more than people are giving him credit for.
I agree.
Because he distributes the ball, I think, in general, a little bit better than Green does, because I think Green's instinct is not always pass first.
Right.
And Phinisee, I think his instinct is pass first. And I think that is how, when he was healthy, I think Juwan Morgan was getting better looks. I think Romeo Langford was getting better looks, like, off of assists, instead of having to. Romeo and Juwan are able to create good looks for themselves. Yeah. But I think Phinisee setting them up with good looks is an underrated aspect of this offense that's been missing.
I agree with that. And I'll add on the defensive end, just having Phinisee in the rotation, giving you a second guy who can bother a great scorer like Carsen Edwards, kind of be a physical defender. He's really quick, really strong, especially for his age. Just having two guys that can do that is a really valuable thing defensively.
Yeah, and quick hands would be really good against Edwards because Edwards can be prone to the turnover. Even as much as he produces on offense, he averages over 3 turnovers a game. So, and that's most of Purdue's turnovers because Purdue as a team doesn't really turn it over much.
And only 3.2 assists, too.
Right. Purdue as a team is kind of Michigan light in the way they don't turn the ball over. They only 10.7 turnovers a game. That's top 20 in the country. Yeah. But Edwards has over 3 turnovers per game. So if you're able to bait him into a few turnovers or just kind of swipe the ball from him a few times if he starts getting a little reckless, I mean, those are momentum plays in a rivalry game.
Yeah, I agree. Let's wrap things up here. Who wins the game?
I think Purdue wins the game.
I think so too.
By
what margin? I guess the more interesting question is the margin.
What do you think?
I'd say maybe like 7 points.
By 7? Yeah, I'll go a little bit higher. I think it's going to be like 10 or 11.
Okay.
But it was Indiana lost by
That's 2 possessions, so it's pretty close.
Indiana lost by 13-14 against Nebraska?
15.
They lost by 15 against Nebraska. And I'll say this, I think it'll end up being like 10 or 11, but I think it'll be a much closer game than the Nebraska game was.
I agree. And it's kind of the same thing we say about Assembly Hall. Just the way that can kind of, if it's a close game, if it's kind of a toss-up, the way that can kind of turn things. Mackey Arena is very similar. It's a tough place to play. They give Purdue a really good home court advantage. And then, to kind of bring things full circle, like we talked about at the top of the show, Purdue has all the momentum in the world right now, and Indiana is really on a slide.
Yeah, and the Mackey Arena home court advantage is real. I mean, they've lost 6 games this year, but none of them have been at Mackey. Yeah. They haven't lost at Mackey since February of last season.
I'm very excited to go to my first game in Mackey.
It's fun.
I've heard really, really good things about it in terms of
it's a good atmosphere.
The environment. Yeah. So I'm really looking forward to that. I'm sure our listeners are as well. We can't wait to bring you all the coverage from Mackey Arena. I'll be on the WIUX broadcast, color commentary. In case, for whatever reason, you don't want to listen to Don Fisher on the radio, you've got that backup option. I'll have the Assembly Call post-game email after that game. You will be writing for Inside the Hall, have a notebook to go up after the game. And we'll be at the game on Saturday. Looking forward to it. Seth, I'll talk to you then. And for everyone listening, we'll talk to you next time.
If you want to support Podcast on the Brink, here is the single best way to do it. Tell anyone you know who loves IU hoops about us and suggest that they subscribe. Podcast on the Brink can be found on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Tell your social media followers, email your friends, text your family members. For weekly discussion about IU basketball, they need to be subscribed to Podcast on the Brink. We'll talk to you next time. Go Hoosiers.